So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Ray, Director of the American Indian Program here at New Mexico State University, and we want to welcome you to our American Indian Program Mini Big Read series. You know, we're wanting to start this as we come together to create community. And sometimes it's how we interpret things of a common, background, common things going on. And this one being that we've all read the common book of Dr. Hobson's The Removed. So when we come to this, we all have our own outlooks, we all have our own opinions, we also have our own thoughts and biases when reading this that we can address to our own community and our own life. So let me go ahead and start off with introducing Dr. Brandon Hobson. So Dr. Brandon Hobson is earned his PhD in creative writing from Oklahoma State University. He has also written the book Where the Dead Sit Talking, which was a finalist for the 2008 National Book Award. Currently he's an assistant professor here of creative writing at New Mexico State University, but he's also a writing mentor and professor over at the Institute of American Indian Arts. Dr. Hobson is an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and I'm sure he can add a lot more than I could right there. So I'm going to give to you, Dr. Brandon Hobson.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to be here. And I was going to ask if you wanted me to read or how you want to start with a Q&A and for a discussion about the book. I'm happy to engage in whatever way you'd like.
I think that would be great. If you can give us a little bit of a reading on how, a particular passage. And, I know this is one of those things where we get to talk with authors. Like, what was the inspiration behind that particular passage that you've chosen to read with us?
Okay. Yeah, I'll go ahead and I'll start out by reading late in the book. There is a spirit ancestor named Chala who narrates parts of the book. And his name Chala is taken from the word Chalagi, which is Cherokee, actually, in the Cherokee language. And so it's a shortened version. So Chala is narrating, also talking about traditional stories that come out of Cherokee traditional stories. And so I'm going to read a little bit from Chala, one of Chala's sections here. Beloved, regarding my death, I do not understand the reason why I awoke when I did. The soldier had taken my life and your life from us, from our family. We were no longer of this world. I saw only dark red, the color of blood. In death, as we slept beneath the earth with the worms and the cold mud and rocks, hearing the soulful howl of the coyotes and the drummings of our people, as we slept beneath the feet of those who stomped the ground and shook the heavens, I felt your mother's aching. I felt her suffering as if it were my own, a suffering so great I felt my spirit move restlessly in an unfathomable darkness. How long was I dead? Surely not long. I crawled out of the earth like a beast in the night, with necklaces made of bear claws and gold, with wet mud and worms matted to my hair, which hung to my chest. I crawled out of the grave and felt as strong and mighty as a horse, even though I knew I had died. I remembered the story of the tribe of root eaters and acorn eaters, whose wives were buried in the same grave as their husbands. And I feared I would look down into the grave and see my wife. In the old story of the root and acorn eaters, a lighted pine knot was placed in a wife's hand. A rope was tied around her body with a bundle of pine knots, and she was lowered into her husband's grave, where she would die after the last pine knot was burned. I feared I would find my wife's body in the grave, burned and dead, and the fear consumed me like a great fire. When I looked down, I was happy to see that the grave was empty. And here I stood, not of flesh, but of spirit, not of bone or skin, as I had known. In this world around me, I saw a great fire, right there in the same world where I had lived. A great fire spreading across the sky, heavy in flames, flashing and blinding, and I saw animals running to the trees and birds flying in the sky. Soon the birds changed into children and then disappeared into the flames. I saw columns of smoke leading to the heavens. I saw snakes with their heads chopped off. Their mouths were still biting. Their bodies slithered into the ground and turned into dust. The dust rose into more columns of smoke. I saw figures in that dust, figures whose faces I did not recognize, but whose bodies were strong, who rose up and drifted away as dust. They rose up and drifted as dust, falling into the great fire. And this sight was beyond anything I had ever dreamed. I saw the winged bodies of others forced into a vortex of wind and smoke, disappearing into the great fire, yet I was not afraid. I could see for miles. I saw boys from my childhood dragging their dead mother around so that corn would grow. They were wailing in fear. I called out to them, but they couldn't hear me. Most of our people were at stockades waiting to be moved west. Our people were being forced out of our land. This I knew, but I could not understand why. My thoughts were cloudy and confused as they can be in sleep. I tried to remember my name, but I fell into a strange loss of thought. For what reason did I awake? Why did I see these visions in the night? I saw ox carts and soldiers with rifles. I heard the crying of children and saw our feeble elders being lifted into government wagons. I saw a flash of light across the sky. A pale mist swirled before me like a small tornado, holding the image of someone I recognized. You, beloved, a strange vision unlike anything I had ever seen before. I wasn't able to speak or call your name, and in an instant you dissolved. Across the land, I heard the wailing of someone in pain. I shouted, but when I spoke, I heard no language, no sounds of words. Instead, I heard from my voice a tiresome moan. The soldiers must not have heard me, as I was very far away. I shouted again, and this time, again, a weary moan. Nobody seemed to hear me. I became frightened of myself, and for a moment I wondered if I had changed form or identity. As I examined myself, I saw I wore a buckskin, and I could not feel my skin. Clearly, I was a spirit now. I felt the earth beneath my feet. When I stomped, I heard nothing. I tried to adjust to the elements, breathing deep. I did not hunger or thirst. I cried out in Cherokee like a wounded dog. I saw myself as a strong, fierce presence. The air sharpened, the sting in my eyes, and I knelt down and felt the ground for dirt, which I rubbed together in my hands to create heat. I placed my palms on both eyes, and when I opened them this time, I saw those who had died before me, warriors, hundreds of them. I saw their sleek figures and ravenous black hair and a thick swirling dust building behind them. They wielded black and red clubs, the colors of courage and blood. They were watching me from a distance, for what reason I do not know, and I could hear them calling out to me. In the distance, I saw fires aroused from smoldering coals. I was left alone in the night, alone, near a stream reflecting the quivering moonlight. I approached the water and leaned over to look at my reflection. The image peering back at me in the water was not the face I had during my life, but some hazy figure whose eyes I could not see. I stood and looked to the sky where I saw two lights in the darkness. The stars told me our people would be held at a campsite nearby, and I needed to help them. I heard the howling of a wolf across the stream and saw that the wolf appeared to be in pain, lying on its side. Wading through the stream in shallow water, I felt no bottom to the stream. I crossed the water to the wolf, which howled again in pain, and I could see that the skin on the wolf's neck had been ripped out, exposing blood and bone. I knelt down and placed my hand on the wound, which made the wolf stop howling. Then the wolf stared at me. His eyes held my gaze. He spoke to me through his eyes. There's a great sadness coming to the people in this land, he said. Your people are being forced to leave, to move west, and many will suffer and die. I did not speak, but I knew I did not trust him. He continued to stare at me. If you want a sign that I speak the truth, you must first throw me into the water. So I lifted the wolf and placed him in the shallow water, and I saw that the wound had healed. Then I stood back, and the wolf came out of the water and shook its body dry. For this, I will protect your family. For this, because you are a spirit, you should know that you can transform yourself into a creature for eternity. The wolf turned and walked away. Then I followed the trail leading to the campsite along the westward trail. I never tired. I walked and walked. Along the way, I stopped and knelt down to wash my hair in a stream. My reflection was too dark to see, even in moonlight. The water rippled. I kept my hands with water and drank as I had done in my life. Despite the winter, the water running down my chest and my back didn't feel cold. And I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Brandon.
Sure.
One of the things that sometimes comes up and sometimes doesn't come up within some of Native American literature is the inclusion of the old stories. We sometimes hear when we're growing up, but unless we remember them, we don't usually hear them when it comes to our adulthood. I thank you for bringing some of that into your writing, but is there a difficulty in doing that when it comes to, knowing that all tribal communities are completely different when it comes to their sharing of culture and community? Is this something that is widely done in the Cherokee community, or is this something that you had to like a little wrestle with when it comes to including this?
The stories that I included were not an issue. I think some might be a little bit more sensitive than others. I really tried to include the stories that I felt like paralleled some of the suffering that or trauma that was going on with the family, and I really wanted to do something different with this book. I love the old traditional stories. They're beautiful and they're sad, and there are so many. Every community has different stories, and I in a way I want to preserve in modern literature some of those stories and incorporate them. But at the same time, the reason I did it in this way is to parallel the violence that happened 200 years ago with the violence that's happening right now, with specifically the U.S. government or police violence. And Michael, one of the things when I started writing this was a reaction to violence against Natives. And I'm from Oklahoma. I lived there my whole life. And there's a family, and back in 2014, the Good Blanket family, they're a Cheyenne and Arapaho family, and they lost their son to a police shooting, unfortunately. And they called the police for help because they were afraid he was going to hurt himself. And when they went outside to when the police showed up, they waited out there, and the police went in, and he was inside with his girlfriend, and his girlfriend came out in tears, saying that he had been shot. And so that story haunted me, and the question of justice, and also thinking back in terms of the violence from 200 years ago, and even in the 1970s with the American Indian movement. That really started, as you know, out of violence in Minneapolis, out of violence, police violence against natives. And so Dennis Banks was one of the founders of the American Indian movement. He has a fantastic autobiography called Ojibwe Warrior. I don't know if you've ever read it, or it's an amazing autobiography that really talks a lot about his involvement in starting the American Indian movement in the early 70s, and his life. Russell Means is mentioned, and Russell Means, by the way, also has a book called Where White Men Fear to Tread. That's worth reading. Those are two, if people have not read, in terms of the history of thinking about, those are two very important figures, I think, for the American Indian movement. But I was thinking, look at the violence that is still going on against groups and communities. And has anything really changed? And sadly, I thought I really want to write. I want to write a novel about this, and also I didn't want to write about the act itself. So the Removed is not about the violence. What it's about is the trauma that comes after the violence. So that the entire novel is set 15 years after the shooting, after the violence, and how the family is dealing with their trauma in the same way that their ancestor is relating his story, and how he and his son were killed for refusing to leave. And Chala, by the way, is based on a real figure named Chali, who was killed by the US government for refusing to leave. So I really wanted to write a modern novel exploring, if anything else, the questions: how do we heal from such trauma? And that goes back to over 200 years specifically.
Very true. And, the American Indian movement and its creation, when it comes to that violence, definitely a pivotal portion of our US history. We have family stories of one of my aunties going down to one of the police departments to get out a couple of my uncles with a big old moose gun way back in Minnesota. So, for many, that is just not a national story, but family stories as well. Like you mentioned, with the family in the community in your area. And one of the questions that came up with Dr. Judith Flores Camona was, you mentioned the inspiration of the book, but also in the characters. You mentioned and you bring up the historical, not even just historical trauma, but the trauma that each of the characters and the way that they interact with the community, what they interact with the family, is really different. And how each individual takes that in that way. Is it a composite of different characters, or is this, how did that come to be when it comes to the characters you put in there?
Well, I knew I wanted to write about one family and their trauma after this, how this one event of the shooting continues to affect the family members in their own way. And so I started with the mother, Maria, and her husband, Ernest, she's seeing the decline of his memory after being diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And so they are called on for an emergency foster care placement. So they take in a foster boy who reminds them in so many ways of Ray, their son who was shot, that it almost serves as a sort of healing mechanism. At least that's what Maria is telling us. She's really seeing how great Ernest is feeling just from the fact of his feeling close to this foster boy who comes in and stays with him. So that was one thread. The other two threads were the other siblings from Ray Ray. So Sonia's sections, I knew I wanted her to be involved with a guy who, and hopefully, I'm not going to give, hopefully everybody's read it, but the reason she's pursuing this guy is because his dad was the police officer who shot her brother. And so, so she pursues him. And yet at the same time, we see him turn violent against her. And I really wanted to address in some way the violence against women, specifically Native women. And so that was her thread. And then with Edgar's thread was dealing with substance abuse, but I wanted Edgar to go to a place called that's mentioned in the old stories called the Darkening Land. And so he ends up in this sort of Darkening Land place that I wanted to be not really too much different than where we are right now in terms of the way that people treat him and talk to him and react to him. And they're forming this video game about shooting, specifically shooting natives, and which it may sound absurd, but there's an actual video game out there, which I just learned recently, called This Land Is My Land, or This Land, and it's not a shooting game, but it's a very inappropriate game about natives, not created by natives. So it's very, very problematic. And but to me, thinking, well, that's just an absurd idea, but here's a video game, a shooting video game that I'll write about, and so I wanted Edgar's sections to be somewhat absurd, but at the same time to feel hauntingly real on some level. And so, and for him to have the same fear of being shot in the way that his brother was shot. So it all comes down to violence, the violence that they're all dealing with. The Mother and Ernest, not so much, but they're really, Maria is really the force of this family. She's trying to gather everybody together for their bonfire that they have every year, and just for family time. And it's just been, it's very difficult for her because of the circumstances. And so, so I basically went through each character's thread and wrote each one at a time, and thought, well, it's just really about this family, and they're each dealing with trauma in their own way.
And thank you for bringing up the Darkening Place when it comes to, there is that widespread thought that the afterlife or limbo is going to be this magical, wonderful place where everybody coexists happily. But again, it's that the theoretical reality of, is it just another place that exists in our current way, where the racism still persists, the xenophobia, the whatever extras that still remain. And I definitely enjoy that you talked about the video game, because when we sometimes bring out the attention of either violence against other people or people other than one another, you often see that go underground in a particular way. It's not like it doesn't exist anymore. It just finds a deeper, darker place to go to. Like you mentioned with the video game of that racism, hatred, it just put into a new medium where others may not know it or not have found it yet, or to be shared amongst one another, to kind of go through the whole process of finding that community. Because it's many communities still exist, and sometimes they're not the greatest of communities when it comes to bringing a positive light.
Right, yeah. So, and the other thing is, what I really wanted to try to avoid also is falling into any kind of stereotype for these characters, right? I really tried. I think that no matter whom we're writing about or what group we're writing about, I always talk to students about this. You always want to avoid falling into a stereotype of someone, and so it's a little bit tricky when I'm including some of the traditional stories, and you start talking about spirit world, natural world stuff. I know that's a little bit tricky, but it's I hope that it serves its purpose. I hope that it serves its purpose in the context of the novel and what I was trying to do.
And before we, I put in the chat that if anybody has any questions, please let us know, and then we'll go ahead and either ask them for you, or if you wish to ask them yourself, please put your hand up in the reactions button. But the next question, that I had is, I really enjoyed the Edgar character when he was in Albuquerque, and particularly talking about his fowl, or his little red fowl, and just that, thought process of addiction when it comes to
Exactly.
Everybody believes they're going to handle addiction in a positive way. It's not going to be like what they saw on TV, or it's not going to be like the person that they see that they still, look down upon. But we all believe that, we're going to do it right. We're going to have it a better way. And was there, how did that kind of come to be when it comes to that description? Because I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Well, that came a little bit later. I knew I wanted to include a metaphor in some way, some sort of surreal metaphor. And so part of what I'm interested in as a fiction writer is also focusing on language. I'm very interested in language. I in fact, most fiction writers, or at least writing literary fiction, are interested in language and playing with language. And so with the fowl, the red fowl, I chose the word fowl, F-O-W-L, because it's kind of a cryptic sounding word also. It's not, like bird doesn't sound really cryptic. Dove or robin or blue jay, but fowl is kind of a cryptic sounding word. And I wanted this to be a metaphor for his addiction, and that it's constantly following him. In fact, it starts out as a small little thing, and then it slowly grows into something that he can't really control, or at least it follows him everywhere he goes, as addiction does. And so it's odd. I'm glad that you caught that. I thought it was really obvious that it was a metaphor for addiction, but I've done so many Zoom readings where people have told me they just thought it was just something weird that I put in there just for weirdness sake, and that's not that was not my intention. I understand it's a strange it's a strange moment in the book when the red fowl is there, but I really wanted to show how addiction is always right there, just sort of following him, and to present it in a different way. I think we've seen addiction written about where it's been a metaphor for something a little bit more like monstrous, maybe, or devilish or something. And so I did it by thinking of the word foul. It just sounds like a dirty word to me, foul. So that was part of my interest there. I see Chad. Chad is a student of mine, and a fantastic writer. Has a question, it looks like.
Great. Yeah, Chad, if you can go ahead and unmute and start your video, we can go ahead and put you on the spot. You can ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Hobson, for doing this. And big thank you to Michael Ray for getting me a book this morning. I'm just at the end right now. I muted right when you talked about the sister and giving something away. So I'm
Oh,
glad I
okay.
did
Yes.
that. But my question, in reading this and then in reading your last book, Where the Dead Sit Talking, there's this immense sadness in not just in what's happening, but also in the language and the prose that you're using. But there's also just this huge sense of hope at the same time, just all throughout, and especially in what you're writing. And I'm wondering how, if you could just speak on that, how do you find the balance between those two?
I mean, it's hard. It's really hard, and that's what we do. We depend on community, our writing community, you know, to help us. And I knew I wanted to end on hope, but you can go overboard on hope, and then it becomes kind of sappy and overly sentimental. I do really like sentimental. I like sentimental stuff, and but I didn't want it to end in a dark place. And a lot of this book has to do with, there are colors, or lack of colors, especially with Edgar's sections in the Darkening Land, the really desolate kind of lack of dim light and not much color until the end of his sections. And then I really put in a lot of reds and golds and greens and whites as he follows the trail home. And in Maria's sections, I really wanted to focus on the colors. And so I think in a way that becomes, I'm really interested in symbols and metaphors and language as a writer. So I think we can sometimes provide and show hope. Maybe I'm always big on, and Chad knows this from class, but I'm always on, I'm huge on showing, and doing more showing and less telling. And through imagery and through sensory details. And so I tried to use, you know, colors, the gold of the fire, and I doing things with gravity in this book, that the rain lifts from the earth to the sky, and the trees are all very, very active and very colorful and full of movement and sounds. And so the way ultimately, I'm sort of getting away from your question, Jen, I apologize. But I wanted to go back to trauma for a minute. That I also feel this is important to mention, is that I wanted to show the trauma of the land as much as from the family, so that we're seeing that the land suffers, remembers history, and the land suffers trauma in the same way that people do. And so how do you end on hope without seeming overly sentimental and telling? And so that's where I just sort of really tried to focus on the colors and the imagery as I got toward the end there.
So our next question comes from Madeline De Herrera. She's our American Indian Program student assistant, and she brings up, you know, she's really interested to learn more about the Wyatt character. She really enjoyed reading about him. How did that character come to be? You know?
Yeah, thanks for that, Wyatt. Everybody really loves Wyatt. I knew that I wanted Wyatt to be this 13, I think he's a 13-year-old boy, 12 or 13 year old boy who is a little bit funny in his own way. He's a little bit eccentric. He feels to Ernest like he's walked out of the past from the 50s or the 40s, because he likes to listen to jazz music, and he has a record collection, and you know, even the way he dresses, wearing saddle shoes. And I knew I wanted to make him eccentric in a kind of a lovable way. Now, the thing about writing about children characters, I tell my students this, is that the reader automatically has a sense of empathy for a child. You don't have to, it's not like an adult character that a reader has to understand and like the character. If a character is unlikable, usually with children, they're even when they're trying to be troublemakers or they're getting into trouble, they're still likable because they're kids. It's like puppies or something, right? That it's hard to you can't really write about a mean puppy, and or kitten. And so that's I always think uh, the more eccentric you can make a child, then the better they work in fiction. Even if that means that they're employing some sort of adult behavior, and by that I mean that they're using expressions that adults might use, right? Or I'm reminded of a book by Marie Bertino, that she wrote a book called 2 a.m. in the Cat's Pajamas a few years ago. And it's a novel about a 10-year-old, I believe she's 10 years old, a girl, and she smokes cigarettes, but she wants to be a jazz singer. And she's just this kind of precocious but lovable little girl. And even though she's like smoking cigarettes, you think, oh my gosh, she's only 10. There's something that is very sort of adorable about it and endearing about that character. And so I think that you can write endearingly about children, and it almost always works in fiction. So that was really thank you for that, Madeline, because I tried to make him as also not falling into the stereotype of what many people think foster kids. Many people think foster kids, well, they look a certain way, or they act and are very rebellious, and so I really wanted to get away from that stereotype of foster kids with.
Great. And we have a question brought up by Dylan McDonald from our library. And he brings up, he'd love to hear you talk about how you develop and nourish plot devices and the character personalities and motivators. And you brought up a little bit about Wyatt, and where you're talking about children, but some of the adult characters as well that are kind of in there.
Yeah, so plot is a tricky thing because I don't consider myself a writer big on plot. And I think that that more genre fiction focuses on plot, like mysteries or horror novels or romance or something. But literary fiction generally is more character-based. I think that I'm probably a more character-based writer than plot. But every stories are about problems. So every story has to have a problem or tensions in them. So the tension in this story is how each character is struggling with trauma and trying to grieve. And so Chekhov says stories should explore questions. So that was one of the questions that I began with, was how does a family grieve after such trauma, after the trauma of losing a family member to police violence? That was really my starting point. And from there, I started thinking about violence against natives in general, or against people of color. That's very timely right now. When I started writing this, this was before George Floyd and everything, which just happened last year. I've been done with this book for over a year now. It takes it about a year to come out after you finish it. But I started writing this in, I would say, 2018. It's been a good 2 years writing it. But I from there, I went on to thinking about specifically violence and how long it's been going on. As I said earlier, 200 years ago, and then the American Indian movement, and it's still going on. I thought about the Good Blanket family And then I started looking up online and seeing, wow, this really is happening a lot. And so it really, I don't know that there's really a plot device as much as I just thought, okay, what do I want to do with this character? Well, I think so I started with Maria, and I thought, well, Maria is the mother, and Ernest, her husband, is starting to lose his, she's dealing with the problem and the tension of him in the early stages of Alzheimer's. And then it's just a matter of just seeing what happens. I'm a big believer in just sitting down to the page and seeing what happens and going with it, because doors will open along the way as you write. Dylan, I don't know if you're a writer or not. It may not mean anything, but as the more you write, doors will come open in your thoughts and within the story, and you know how the characters will react. So I always begin with just thinking about what's the main problem that they're going through.
And to go a little bit back, you mentioned Wyatt, the stereotype of the foster care system, that stereotypical foster child. In your other book, where the dead sit talking, there was a foster system that was brought up in there, and that kind of parallel the common thread, or at least a theme that might be in there. Is there a reason of the bringing in foster children into the books that you're reading, or through that process?
Because I did social work. I was in social work for about 7 years before I did my PhD, and so I have encountered so many different families and so many different kids from all different spectrums, and I wanted to add a healing mechanism for Ernest in this book. And I thought, how can his memory begin to appear to improve in this sort of, and I wanted to do it in a very sort of beautiful way. And I thought, well, why not bring in a child who reminds them of their son, and that the fact that it feels like his son is actually there with him begins to have this miraculous effect on his memory, because that Alzheimer's is kind of living in an alternate reality with the decay of memory and the decay of the mind. So that's probably the main reason I knew I wanted to do it through a foster kid. I don't know that I'll ever write anything again, because now 2 books have had foster kids in them. So I don't know that that I'm going to continue writing about, I don't keep writing about foster kids or anything, but that was, I thought that's a good way for me to also address in another example of breaking the stereotype of foster kids.
Great. I'm so glad that you brought up that portion about that healing when it comes to having the memory come back. The father, that was one of my thoughts of, we talk about it in like the grander scape of things, when hearing from tribal communities that there's songs that are no longer told, or there's stories that are no longer told. And in this, greater scheme of the historical trauma that has gone on for centuries, as we start to heal, as a nation and as various tribal communities, will some of these things come back, as, we've not brought them because either, again, the forgetting, but again, was this ceremony, was this story, was this song not safe in our current area? And is it kind of like a way of protecting them? And, but I just really, again, enjoy that healing aspect that you brought out when it comes to working through that process of seeing that embodiment of that memory of his child again, and how everything just started coming back. And it wasn't the westernized medicine, as the doctor had brought it up. Right. It was, just almost that organic, thought process and emotional portion of it.
Yeah, that was the other thing, is I wanted it to be very organic, and a lot of this book focusing on the land and on trauma and memory. And Wyatt is a storyteller. And so when he's this sort of leader, that I wanted him to be, this little guy who, after school, he's even organizing the flag football game. He's like, you guys over here, and you guys were, and he's sort of running around like being the coach. And in a way, stories serve as, I guess, as a way of healing also. And I wanted to show that a little bit, even though not all even the minor characters in this book are also sort of storytellers. Even the dangerous people in the darkening land are storytellers, but their stories don't have the effect, right, that Wyatt's do, and Chala's do, and they're telling stories that are just, sort of bizarre, random stories. And so part of it comes down to thinking about stories as healing also.
Okay, we have a Dennis who's going to be asking you a question, so I'm going to ask him to unmute.
Hey, Dennis.
Hey, Dr. Hobson, how are you?
Hey, good, yeah.
Hey, thank you very much for this book. It's a fantastic book. I guess I have a question. It's about writing. You talked about the importance of character in your writing. And, in this book, you're writing in the first person from the point of view of a lot of different characters, and some of them very divergent, particularly the character of Chala. And I guess my question is, as a writer, how do you sort of inhabit those other points of view and of the various characters, and kind of inhabit that point of view?
In that voice specifically.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis, for that question, because that's one of the challenges, I think, of being a fiction writer, is we have to get inside the heads of multiple characters in anything that we write, and it's very difficult for me to write from the perspective. I don't know how well I pulled it off, of someone like Maria, who's in her 70s, and is a woman who's lost a child. I'm not in my 70s. I'm not a woman, and I've not lost a child. So that's so what I had to do for thinking about Maria, in fact, I originally had her sections in third person, because I thought, I don't know that I can employ that voice and pull it off very well. And my editor really, really stressed that I should try. So what I did was I talked to a friend of my mom's who has lost a child, and really thought about her voice, and that really helped, I think, with Maria's sections. And then I think Edgar's and Sonia's and then Chala's all were very, I hope they were distinct in their language, and in the way that I used vocabulary. I tried to use very short, direct sentences, especially with Edgar's sections, because I wanted his, I used a lot of repetition on purpose also. And I did that with Chala's, actually. In other words, like saying, I saw this, I saw that, I saw this, is done on purpose. And so the part of that was just thinking about, once I understood and I can see the character, I know what Chala looks like, I know what Edgar looks like, I know what Sonia looks like, and I know what Maria looks like, just in my imagination. And so that probably sounds really abstract if you're not a fiction writer, but the more you get them on the page, the more the easier it becomes. And so it's just a matter of hearing their voice at some point it just clicks in your head and you can hear the voice. But I really, really did struggle with Maria's because I thought, oh, I don't know if I'm, so I had a good, I don't know, 60 or 70 pages, maybe more, of third person that I went back and entirely rewrote in first after working with my editor on it, and thinking about my mom's friend and listening to her voice. And so, yeah.
Definitely. Thank you for sharing a part of that, writing process that, sometimes we don't even get to know about, think about when it comes to the depths that it takes of writing in that voice or in that style.
Yeah.
Now that I can use this as a plug for your writing classes and the creative writing program, what are some of the things that, in talking with developing writers, with new writers, is there I don't know, how do we begin? How do we talk about, either story? How do we bring this up that you would want to give to any writer who's starting on up?
Well, I mean, we all have stories in our lives that are important to be told. And I think in different communities, I always start with, take risks, and don't be afraid that to put anything down on paper. And your stories that are out there, if you have this desire, look at how other people are doing it, right? Leslie, I was on a panel the other night for the LA Times Book Festival, and it was really celebrating Leslie Silko. And one of the things that Danielle, the other panelist, was talking about, how Silko writes non-linear and employs this kind of surrealness to a lot of, especially in the book Ceremony, which is should be required reading for everybody. It's just an amazing novel. But part of memory, we don't think linearly with memories, right? When you think about childhood, something that you may think, oh yeah, I remember going to school in 5th grade or something. Your memories don't start back with and go in order. They happen in very different and nonlinear ways. And fiction can do that also. And because so much of fiction is memory. And so and I know that's a bigger sort of structural question or response, I think, in terms of how we structure it. But I think it's good to start with looking at the books that you love to read or the stories that you love to read, and thinking about, first of all, there should be a problem that if everything is going great, nobody wants to read that story, right? Everything is everybody's happy, and you're writing about a guy who wakes up and he's got a great job and he's got a great family around him, and he goes in his car and he goes to work and has a great lunch. That's a terrible story because there's no problem. There's something, the tension, and often beginning with questions. How do we deal with trauma? How do we grieve over these things? How do we deal with violence? How do we deal with racism? How do we deal with whatever it is, and then let the characters deal with that, with those questions. So I think starting with questions like that is always a good way to begin thinking about fiction.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Hobson, for
Sure.
having the time, spending the time with us, and bringing this book into the world and giving us this amazing look into community, giving this amazing look into just how acts can ripple and how we then move through them, with them, at them. And just thank you again for being a part of our American Indian Program mini Big Read series. But definitely, we wish to thank you for coming on in. We wish to thank everybody who's taken the time out of their busy lives to come and join with us, create community, and definitely taking the time to read the book. We look forward to having additional author talks and conversations. As Brandon makes more books, we can bring him in, but also we want to highlight the other authors that we have on campus. And as we include many journals who are, starting here at continuing here at New Mexico State University.
Yeah.
So thank you, Dr. Hobson, for your time. Thank you, everybody, for your time as well.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks to everybody. Thanks especially for reading the book. I really means a lot. So.
And we'll see everybody. Have a great day.
Okay. Thank you all.